The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. As Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles one final time, it was June 4th, 1942, and something electric hung in the Pacific air attention that every sailor, pilot, and officer could feel in their bones. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor had burned. 6 months since America had been thrust into a war that would reshape the world forever. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in the operations room at Pearl Harbor, his weathered hands spread across a massive chart of the Pacific. Intelligence reports lay scattered before him. Like pieces of a deadly puzzle, the Japanese were coming, that much was certain. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor's destruction, was orchestrating something massive, something that could determine the fate of the Pacific theater. According to declassified U.S. Navy intelligence reports from the National Archives, the breaking of the Japanese Naval Code JN-105 provided crucial insights into enemy movements. Captain Joseph Rockford hunched over his desk in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, surrounded by stacks of decoded Japanese communications. His team of cryptanalysts had been working around the clock, their eyes burning from exhaustion, their minds racing to stay ahead of the enemy. The code name AF kept appearing in intercepted messages, a target so important that Yamamoto himself was leading the assault. AF is Midway, Rockford announced to his superior, his voice hoarse but certain. They're coming from Midway Atoll, and they're bringing everything they've got. The same man who had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor now commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sailed in formation, their decks crowded with Nakajima fighters and Aichi dive bombers. Yamamoto's strategy was ambitious yet simple: lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and crush it completely. With Midway captured and the American carriers destroyed, the path to Hawaii and possibly the American West Coast would lie open. The war could be won in a single, crushing blow. But unknown to the Japanese, their every move was being watched, decoded, and anticipated. Nimitz had made a decision that would either save the Pacific Fleet or doom it entirely. Rather than retreat, he would turn Midway into a trap. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, would lie in wait northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon. The stage was set for one of the most consequential naval battles in human history. On one side, the Japanese combined fleet, drunk on 6 months of unbroken victory and convinced of their own invincibility. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines warming up. Across for Japanese flight decks, 0 for 30 hours. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first wave of 108 aircraft off the carriers of the WWII, the Japanese strike force that had become the terror of the Pacific. Aboard the USS Yorktown, radar operator Seaman First Class Joseph Mason stared at his green screen in disbelief. Dozens of blips had appeared on the edge of his radar's range, moving steadily toward Midway Atoll. Large formation of aircraft bearing 3 to 0 degrees. Distance 150 miles and closing, he reported, his voice tight with urgency. The warning reached Midway just minutes before the Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon. Like a dark cloud of death, Marine Fighter Squadron 221, led by Major Floyd Parks, scrambled every available aircraft, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcats. They climbed desperately into the morning sky, knowing they were outnumbered and outgunned. The aerial battle above Midway was savage and brief. The Japanese Zero fighters, piloted by veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, tore through the American formation with ruthless efficiency. Major Parks' Buffalo exploded in a ball of flame, taking the squadron commander with it. Of the 26 Marine fighters that rose to meet the enemy, only 10 would return, most of them shot full of holes. Below, Midway Atoll erupted in explosions as Tominaga's bombers found their targets. The power plant disappeared in a mushroom of smoke and debris. Fuel storage tanks sent pillars of black smoke climbing into the tropical sky. But the runways remained operational, and the defensive batteries continued to fire. Historical records from the Marine Corps' archives indicate that despite heavy casualties, Midway's air defenses remained partially intact. As Tominaga's strike force winged its way back to the WWII, the lieutenant commander made a fateful radio transmission: "There is need for a second attack wave." The message crackled through the radio receivers aboard Admiral Nagumo's flagship, setting in motion a chain of decisions that would alter the course of the war. Meanwhile, from the American carriers hidden beyond the horizon, revenge was already in the air. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 off the deck of the USS Hornet, followed by dive bombers and fighters from all three carriers. The Americans were launching everything they had in a desperate all-out assault, but coordination between the American squadrons quickly broke down. Radio communications failed, navigation errors scattered the formations, and fuel began to run dangerously low. Waldron's torpedo bombers, flying slow and low in their obsolete Douglas Devastators, pressed on alone toward the Japanese fleet. At 0920 hours, Torpedo Squadron 8 found the enemy. Four massive aircraft carriers steamed in formation, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers, their decks busy with aircraft operations. Waldron knew his squadron was flying into certain death, but he also knew that somewhere behind him, American dive bombers were searching for this same target. Attack immediately, Waldron radioed his pilots. F-15 Devastator torpedo bombers began their final approach. Zero fighters dove from above like hawks, their 20mm cannons blazing. One by one, Waldron's planes caught fire and crashed into the Pacific. The squadron commander himself went down with his aircraft, taking the secret of his courage with him to the bottom of the sea. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived floating in the water with a bullet-riddled life jacket, watching the battle unfold around him. The torpedo attack had been a complete failure, but it had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the enemy carriers naked and vulnerable. High above, completely unnoticed by the Japanese lookouts, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise were finally approaching their target, the sun at their backs and destiny in their hands. At exactly 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered down through the scattered clouds and saw the most beautiful sight of his military career. For Japanese aircraft carriers ranged in a perfect box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was in the midst of a frantic deck operation. Mechanics worked desperately to switch ordnance on the waiting bombers, from armor-piercing bombs for ships back to high-explosive bombs for Midway. Fuel lines snaked across the deck like deadly serpents, while ammunition was stacked in neat, vulnerable piles. "This is it, boys," McCluskey radioed to his dive bomber pilots. "Remember, we get only one chance at this." The American Douglas Dauntless dive bombers tilted into their attack dives, plummeting from 14,000 feet at nearly vertical angles. The pilots pulled their aircraft into screaming dives that tested both man and machine to their absolute limits. G-forces crushed them into their seats as they fought to keep their bomb sights on target. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, selected the Akagi as his target. Through his bomb sight, he could see Japanese sailors running across the carrier's deck like ants from a disturbed nest. At 1,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of his dive so hard that his vision grayed from the tremendous G-forces. The bomb struck Akagi just behind the bridge, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar, where fully fueled aircraft waited for launch. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited, in a chain reaction of destruction. Within minutes, Japan's most famous aircraft carrier was transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, were attacking the Soryu. Leslie's own bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during the approach, leaving him weaponless. But his squadron pressed on without him. 3 direct hits turned Soryu into a blazing wreck in less than 5 minutes. According to official U.S. Navy after-action reports archived at the Naval War College, the coordinated dive bomber attacks achieved complete tactical surprise. Admiral Nagumo, forced to abandon his flagship, transferred his command to a nearby cruiser and watched in horror as his carrier fleet died before his eyes. Within the space of 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The precise, deadly efficiency of the American dive bomber attack had achieved what 6 months of warfare had failed to accomplish. The Japanese Navy had been dealt a crippling blow, from which it would never fully recover. But the battle was far from over. Captain Tomio Kaku of the Hiryu, the only surviving Japanese carrier, immediately launched a counterattack. 18 Aichi dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, roared off Hiryu's deck with orders to find and destroy the American carriers that had inflicted this catastrophe. At 11:30 a.m., radar aboard the USS Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese strike. Fighter Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, climbed to intercept the enemy bombers. Thatch had developed new fighter tactics specifically to counter the superior Japanese Zero, and now those tactics would be put to their ultimate test. The dogfight that followed was a swirling melee of aircraft diving, climbing, and turning in tight circles above the carrier task force. Thatch's innovative beam defense maneuver, later known as the Thatch Weave, allowed his Wildcats to cover each other effectively against the more maneuverable Zeros. But some Japanese bombers broke through the fighter screen. 3 Aichi dive bombers, their pilots displaying the same suicidal courage that had made the Japanese Navy so feared, pressed home their attacks despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, causing massive damage to her flight deck and starting serious fires below. The carrier that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea was crippled once again. But her damage control teams, led by Commander Clarence Aldrich, performed miracles of seamanship. Within 2 hours, Yorktown's fires were extinguished, her flight deck patched. As she was making 20 knots again, the Japanese had drawn blood, but the momentum of the battle remained with the Americans. 3 enemy carriers burned on the horizon, while only 1 American carrier had been damaged. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in full retreat. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon of June 4th, the roles in the Pacific Theater had reversed completely. For 6 months, Japanese carrier aircraft had struck with impunity across the Pacific, but now it was the Americans who held the initiative, and they pressed it mercilessly. Aboard the Enterprise, Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher studied reconnaissance photographs of the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu. Intelligence reports indicated that Captain Tomio Kaku was preparing another strike, possibly the final desperate blow that could still turn the tide of battle. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, made a decision that demonstrated the aggressive spirit that would characterize American naval warfare for the remainder of the war. Rather than wait for the Japanese to strike again, he would send every available aircraft to finish what the morning attack had started. 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet launched into the afternoon sky, their pilots grimly determined to complete the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. Leading the formation was Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, a veteran of the morning's successful attack, his aircraft loaded with a 1,000-pound bomb that could break the back of any ship. The Hiryu fought for her life with desperate courage. Captain Kaku had positioned his carrier in the center of a defensive circle of cruisers and destroyers, all of their anti-aircraft guns trained skyward. Zero fighters patrolled overhead in tight combat air patrols, ready to sacrifice themselves to protect their floating airfield. But American dive bombing technique had reached near perfection. Through months of intensive training, the Dauntless pilots had learned to approach from out of the sun, to vary their dive angles to confuse anti-aircraft gunners, and to concentrate their attacks in devastating salvos that overwhelmed enemy defenses. At 5 o'clock p.m., Gallagher's bombers tilted into their attack dives. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately, filling the sky with black puffs of explosive shells. 2 American bombers were hit and crashed into the sea in flames, but the remainder pressed on through the deadly curtain of fire. For direct hits and several near misses sealed Hiryu's fate within minutes. The carrier's flight deck buckled and split, her hangar decks became raging infernos, and her engine spaces flooded rapidly. Captain Kaku, following the ancient tradition of Japanese naval officers, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of surrender. The classified Japanese naval records, as documented in the post-war Strategic Bombing Survey, confirmed the complete destruction of all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai. With the destruction of Hiryu, Admiral Yamamoto's master plan lay in ruins. The combined fleet commander, aboard his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the devastating news by radio. For aircraft carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation had been sunk in a single day. Hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots had gone down with their ships. Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished career. He could continue with the Midway operation, using his massive surface fleet to bombard the atoll into submission. His battleships and cruisers still outnumbered the Americans significantly, and a nice surface action might yet salvage something from the disaster. But without air cover, his ships would be sitting targets for American land-based bombers at dawn. The loss of 4 carriers had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific so dramatically that continuing the attack would likely result in even greater catastrophes. At 11:55 p.m. on June 4th, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The Midway operation is canceled. All forces will withdraw to the west. Meanwhile, aboard the damaged Yorktown, Captain Elliot Buckmaster was fighting his own desperate battle. The carrier had been struck by 3 bombs during the afternoon Japanese attack, and despite heroic damage control efforts, she was listing badly and losing speed. At 3 p.m., a second wave of Japanese aircraft had found the crippled carrier. This time there were K torpedo bombers from Hiryu, flying just above the wave tops in their final attack run. The torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, causing massive flooding and a dangerous list that threatened to capsize the ship. Abandoned ship, Buckmaster finally ordered, his voice heavy with the agony of command. Yorktown's crew, many of them veterans of the Coral Sea battle just 1 month earlier, reluctantly left their wounded ship. But even as they rowed away in life rafts, many sailors were already planning how they might save her. The Battle of Midway was winding down, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato, watching the last light fade from the Pacific horizon. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had promised his emperor 6 months of victory, now faced the bitter reality of Japan's first major naval defeat. The radio reports from the Kido Butai painted a picture of unmitigated disaster. Akagi, his former flagship and the symbol of Japanese naval aviation, was a burning hulk drifting helplessly on the swells. Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had all met similar fates, taking with them over 200 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced pilots. Rear Admiral Tama Yamaguchi, aboard the dying Hiryu, sent a final message that would haunt Yamamoto for the remainder of the war. I alone am to blame for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. I will remain on board to the end. Banzai for the Emperor. The transmission ended in static as Hiryu's radio room flooded. But Yamamoto was not a man to accept defeat without exploring every option. He still commanded the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific 11 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 13 cruisers, and over 50 destroyers. If he could bring the Americans into a night surface action, Japanese superiority in torpedo warfare and night fighting might yet turn disaster into victory. According to post-war interviews conducted by the U.S. Naval War College with surviving Japanese officers, Yamamoto seriously considered continuing the operation despite the carrier losses. The Japanese admiral's staff gathered in Yamato's operations room to consider their options. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior planning officer, spread charts across the table and began calculating distances and fuel consumption. The American carriers, wherever they were hiding, would need time to rearm and refuel. A high-speed night approach might catch them vulnerable. We could reach the American position by 0 for 100 hours, Kuroshima reported. Our night battle training gives us significant advantages in darkness. But Admiral Matomu Yugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, presented the harsh arithmetic of modern warfare. Without air cover, our ships will be defenseless against land-based bombers at dawn. The Americans have flying fortresses on Midway, and who knows what other aircraft they can bring from Hawaii. 300 miles to the east, Admiral Chester Nimitz was conducting his own strategic assessment. The victory at Midway had been stunning, but the Japanese surface fleet remained largely intact. Radio intelligence indicated that Yamamoto was considering a night attack, and the American admiral had to decide whether to pursue his advantage or consolidate his gains. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Carrier Task Force, recommended caution. His pilots were exhausted, his ships were low on fuel, and the Yorktown was critically damaged. We have accomplished our primary mission, Spruance radioed to Nimitz. The enemy's carrier striking force has been eliminated. I recommend we do not pursue into waters where we might encounter superior enemy surface forces. The decision ultimately rested with Yamamoto, and at 0:25 hours on June 5th, he made the choice that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. The Midway operation is canceled, he announced to his staff. All forces will retire to the west immediately. The withdrawal order rippled through the combined fleet like a shockwave. Destroyers that had been preparing for high-speed night attacks suddenly reversed course. Battleships that had been eagerly anticipating their first surface action since the start of the war began the long retreat toward Japanese waters. Captain Watanabe of the destroyer Tanakaze received orders to remain behind and attempt to rescue survivors from the sunken carriers. As his ship approached the coordinates where Hiryu had gone down, he could see oil-covered sailors clinging to debris in the darkness. Many were badly burned, all were exhausted, but they continued to sing patriotic songs as Tanakaze's crew pulled them from the water. Among the rescue was Chief Petty Officer Abe, a veteran pilot who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. "The Americans fought like demons today," he told Watanabe through swollen lips. "Their dive bombers came out of the sun like avenging angels. We never saw them coming." Dawn on June 5th revealed the full scope of the Japanese disaster. 4 aircraft carriers had been lost, along with 248 aircraft and over 3,000 experienced naval personnel. The Japanese Navy had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover, not just in terms of ships and planes, but in the irreplaceable loss of veteran pilots who had taken years to train. The Americans had lost only one carrier, the Yorktown, which was still afloat, but listing heavily along with 150 aircraft and 307 personnel. More importantly, the core of the U.S. Pacific Fleet remained intact and ready for future operations. As Yamamoto's fleet limped back toward Japan, the admiral composed a message to the emperor that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The 6 months of easy victories were over. From this point forward, every mile of ocean would have to be defended against an increasingly confident and capable American war machine. June 5th dawned gray and overcast, with long Pacific swells rolling endlessly toward the horizon. The USS Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea and now of Midway, lay dead in the water 300 miles northwest of the atoll. Her port side gashed open by torpedo hits, her flight deck buckled from bomb damage. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered his crew to abandon ship the previous afternoon, but as sunrise revealed the carrier still afloat, hope rekindled in the hearts of her sailors. The destroyer USS Hammond came alongside the listing carrier, and salvage crews began the dangerous work of rayboarding their wounded ship. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich, Yorktown's damage control officer, was among the first to climb back aboard. "She's hurt bad," Aldrich reported to Captain Buckmaster, "but she's still fighting." The salvage operation became a race against time and the elements. Work parties struggled to shore up bulkheads, pump out flooded compartments, and transfer fuel oil to reduce the fire hazard. The destroyer USS Hughes brought over portable pumps and emergency generators, while the Hammond's crew connected their ship's power cables to help restore electricity to Yorktown's vital systems. Naval engineering reports from the Bureau of Ships, as documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate navies, detail the heroic damage control efforts aboard Yorktown. By noon on June 5th, the impossible seemed achievable. Yorktown's list had been reduced to 2 degrees, her fires were extinguished, as she was even generating enough steam to make headway at 5 knots. But unknown to the Americans, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged carrier since dawn. The submarine had been dispatched by Admiral Yamamoto with orders to complete what the Kido Butai's aircraft had started. Tanabe was a veteran submarine commander who had already sunk 2 American vessels earlier in the war. Through his periscope, he could see the Yorktown clearly a massive target that would partially avenge the disaster at Midway. The carrier was screened by destroyers, but Tanabe had identified a gap in their patrol pattern. At 1:36 p.m., 168 fired a spread of Type 95 torpedoes at a range of 1,200 yards. The long lance torpedoes, among the most advanced in the world, raced through the clear Pacific water at 48 knots, leaving barely visible wakes on the surface. Lookouts aboard the Hammond spotted the torpedo tracks and screamed warnings across the water. "Torpedoes to starboard! Torpedoes to starboard!" But there was no time to maneuver, no time to escape the underwater death racing toward them. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her starboard side, sending geysers of water and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The 3rd torpedo hit the destroyer Hammond, breaking her back instantly. The 4th torpedo missed, continuing on to arm itself and eventually sink harmlessly in the deep Pacific. Hammond's magazine exploded in a tremendous blast that killed 80 of her crew instantly and sent a shock wave through the water that could be felt 5 miles away. The destroyer, which had been alongside Yorktown helping with salvage operations, broke in half and sank within 4 minutes. The torpedo hit sealed Yorktown's fate. Her starboard side, previously undamaged, was now torn open below the waterline. Seawater poured into her engineering spaces, and her list increased rapidly beyond the point where damage control could compensate. Captain Buckmaster, who had reboarded his ship with such hope just hours earlier, now faced the agonizing decision to abandon her permanently at 2:00 p.m. He gave the order that no naval captain ever wants to give: "All hands, abandon ship. This is no drill." The evacuation was conducted with the professional discipline that had made Yorktown famous throughout the fleet. Despite the increasing list and the constant threat of secondary explosions, sailors formed orderly lines at abandoned ship stations. They helped wounded shipmates over the side, secured classified materials, and even fed the ship's mascot dog into a life raft. Chief Petty Officer George Weiss was among the last to leave. As he slid down a rope into the oil-covered water, he looked back at the carrier that had been his home for 3 years. "So long, old girl," he whispered. "You gave them hell while you could." Yorktown remained afloat through the night, her hull groaning and creaking as internal bulkheads slowly gave way to the inexorable pressure of the sea. At dawn on June 7th, with her flight deck nearly awash, she finally gave up her fight for life and slipped beneath the Pacific waves. The loss of Yorktown was a sad ending to America's greatest naval victory, but it could not diminish what had been accomplished. The Battle of Midway was over, and with it, Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific had ended forever. As the Pacific dawn broke on June 7, 1942, the waters northwest of Midway Atoll held only debris and oil slicks to mark where 5 great warships had fought their final battles. The USS Yorktown had joined the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu on the bottom of the Pacific, but the strategic implications of their sacrifice would echo across the ocean. For the remainder of the war, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, reading the final casualty reports with mixed emotions. The victory at Midway had been stunning, but it had come at a significant cost. 307 American servicemen had given their lives, including some of the Navy's most experienced pilots and sailors. Yet the Japanese losses were staggering by comparison. Over 3,000 men had perished, including many of the elite pilots who had formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation. More critically, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers that would take years to replace time that the rapidly expanding American war machine would not grant them. Post-war analysis by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as documented in the Strategic Planning Division, records confirmed that Midway marked the decisive turning point in the Pacific theater. In Tokyo, the news of the disaster was initially suppressed by government censors. The Japanese public, accustomed to an unbroken string of victories since Pearl Harbor, was told only that fierce fighting continues in the Central Pacific, but within the halls of the Naval Ministry, senior officers understood that Japan's strategic position had been fundamentally altered. Admiral Yamamoto, upon his return to Japan, submitted a frank assessment to the Naval General Staff. "The Americans have demonstrated tactical and technological capabilities that we did not anticipate," he wrote. "Their intelligence gathering, their pilot training, and their damage control procedures all exceeded our estimates. We can no longer assume easy victories against American forces." The strategic ramifications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's plan to establish a defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific had been shattered. Without a strong carrier force, Japanese expansion would be limited to land-based aircraft range, significantly reducing their operational flexibility. Captain Joseph Rockford, the cryptanalyst whose code-breaking had made the victory possible, was quietly awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in a ceremony that few would know about. Until decades later, his basement operation had proved that intelligence could be as decisive as guns and bombs in modern warfare. For the pilots of the American carrier squadrons, Midway represented both vindication and transformation. The obsolete tactics and equipment that had led to disasters, like the destruction of Torpedo Squadron 8, were rapidly being replaced. New aircraft, new techniques, and most importantly, new confidence would characterize American naval aviation from this point forward. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation had found the Japanese fleet at the crucial moment, was promoted and awarded the Navy Cross. In his citation, Admiral Nimitz wrote, "His professional skill and inspiring leadership contributed materially to the success of our forces and the infliction of heavy losses on the enemy." On the Japanese side, the few surviving pilots from the Kido Butai were quickly reassigned to training duties. Their experience desperately needed to prepare new aviators for the increasingly difficult battles ahead, but the Japanese pilot training program, designed for quality over quantity, could never replace losses at the rate that American industrial capacity could produce new aircraft. By autumn of 1942, the strategic initiative had passed irreversibly to the Americans. The landings at Guadalcanal in August marked the beginning of the long American drive across the Pacific, a campaign that would carry them ultimately to the shores of Japan itself. The Battle of Midway, had lasted only for days, but it had changed the course of World War II. The Japanese Empire, which had seemed unstoppable in December of 1941, was now fighting a defensive war against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing month. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor and masterminded Japan's early victories, understood better than most what Midway meant for his country's future. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," he had reportedly said after Pearl Harbor. At Midway, that giant had fully awakened, and its strength would prove irresistible. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, claiming millions of lives and reshaping the geopolitical order. But historians would mark June 4th, 1942, as the day when the tide turned forever, when American determination and Japanese overconfidence met in the vast waters of the Central Pacific, and destiny was decided by the courage of young men flying into the morning sun. The Battle of Midway was over, but its legacy would endure as long as nations remembered the price of freedom and the power of those willing to fight for it.